Imagine a cloth so fine it could slip through a ring, light as woven air, so coveted that Roman senators stood in their marble halls and complained that all the gold in Rome was draining to India because their wives couldn't resist these legendary textiles. That was Dhaka muslin, the world's most prized fabric, India's calling card to global markets for thousands of years. By 1947, that industry had vanished. India's share of the world economy had collapsed from 25% to under 4%. The weavers were gone, the looms were silent. The trade networks that had connected India to every corner of the civilized world for centuries severed. How does the world's textile superpower become an importer of cheap machine cloth? To understand the destruction, first see what existed before the British arrived. Pre-1750, India controlled 25% of global textile exports. Not 2%, not 5%, 25%. Bengal, Gujarat and coastal Andhra weren't just weaving centres, they were economic engines that lifted entire supply chains. Stable international distribution networks meant other Indian industries could piggyback on textile trade routes and reach global markets at reduced cost. The result? A thriving ecosystem. Shipbuilding flourished in Bengali ports, where craftsmen built merchant vessels that lasted over 20 years, nearly double the 12-year lifespan of English ships. Steel production pioneered techniques that became Damascus blades, prized by Arab and European officers as both weapons and status symbols. The quality advantage was undeniable. Dhaka and Murshidabad produced muslins that commanded premium prices across Europe. Benares became synonymous with brocades. Surat evolved into a major commercial hub where merchants from 3 continents converged. Here's how dominant Indian textiles were. British shopkeepers would pass off European cloth as made in India just to charge higher prices. The label itself was worth more than the product. The economic data confirms this wasn't myth. Broadberry and Gupta's research shows India's per capita income, wage levels and urban population percentages in 1700 were comparable to parts of Europe. The Mughal Empire was weakening politically after Aurangzeb's death in 1707, yes, but the economic infrastructure, merchant networks, skilled labour pools, capital markets remained intact and thriving. This wasn't a primitive economy waiting for modernisation. This was a sophisticated industrial system with centuries of refinement. The British didn't find a vacuum, they found competition and they destroyed it. The destruction wasn't accidental, it was policy. A coordinated system that escalated over decades, each tool building on the last to eliminate competition and extract wealth. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company gained revenue collection rights in Bengal. Almost immediately, they established a legal monopoly. If you were a weaver in Dhaka, you now had exactly one buyer, the company. Export markets that had existed for thousands of years were cut off in a single policy stroke. Indian weavers could no longer sell to Dutch, French or Arab merchants. The global distribution networks that had made India wealthy, gone. But the company faced a problem. Indian textiles were still superior to anything Britain could produce, so they added the next tool. Company agents now dictated terms at gunpoint. Weavers who once negotiated prices with competing merchants were forced to accept 15 to 30% of previous market rates. Historical accounts describe agents confining weavers in cages, torturing them to meet quotas. The revenue trick was even more insidious. The company paid using tax money extracted from Indians. No new wealth entered India. The entire system became a closed loop of extraction. Indian wages collapsed. But the weavers couldn't simply switch buyers or move to another region, because the British added step 3. By the 1770s, British-made cloth entered India duty-free through company-controlled ports. Meanwhile, Indian cloth moving between provinces, say from Benares to Calcutta, faced internal transit taxes. A piece of cloth made in Benares and sold in Calcutta was taxed. The same cloth made in Manchester and sold in Calcutta was not. Indian manufacturers competing in their own country paid higher costs than foreign imports. The playing field wasn't just tilted, it was rigged. But British manufacturers still couldn't compete on quality, so they lobbied Parliament hard. By the 1770s, Indian muslins faced 70 to 80% import duties in Britain. Products that had dominated European markets for centuries were priced out of existence overnight. Some argue this was just the natural result of Britain's technological advantage, the power loom, the Industrial Revolution. But here's what their argument misses. A free India could have bought those machines too. Japan wasn't colonized, and Japan industrialized. The technology existed. Indians were barred from accessing it. The proof? Indian textile mills that finally emerged in the 1890s captured 9% of the domestic market, showing Indians could adopt industrial technology when allowed to compete. Between 1820 and 1870, raw cotton exports from India rose from 10,000 bales to 1 million. Finished cloth imports to India rose to 1 billion yards. India converted from exporter of finished goods to exporter of raw materials, the classic colonial reversal, executed in 50 years. But some weavers still tried to practice their craft, so the British deployed the final tool. There are documented incidents of company soldiers smashing hand looms in Bengal weaving districts. The controversial thumb-breaking accounts, recorded by Dutch trader Robert Bolt in the 1770s, are disputed by British historians, but remain part of oral history in Dhaka and Murshidabad. Whether literally true or not, the economic outcome is undeniable. Skilled weavers were driven out of business, unable to practice their craft. By 1870, India's share of world textile trade had collapsed to 2%. These weren't isolated policies, they were an escalating system designed to eliminate competition and extract wealth. The human cost was catastrophic. The numbers tell a story of systematic impoverishment. India's share of world output fell from roughly 25% in 1700 to 4% by 1947. That's not decline, that's demolition. Madison and Broadbury Gupta's research confirms what oral histories had preserved. An economic superpower was reduced to poverty in 2 centuries. Real wages for Indian textile workers fell 50 to 60% between 1750 and 1900. During that same period, British workers' wages rose. The wealth didn't disappear, it moved, but the human dimension shows the true cost. Return to Dhaka, the city that once produced muslin so fine it slipped through rings. In 1760, Dhaka's population stood at 150,000, a thriving urban centre where weavers, merchants, dyers and finishers created textiles that commanded premium prices worldwide. By 1840, Dhaka's population had fallen to 30,000, one of the first cities in history to de-urbanize. Murshidabad, Benares, Surat all saw similar declines as weaving centres collapsed. Where did the weavers go? They had no choice. They fled to the countryside. Picture Dhaka's weavers, men who once commanded premium prices for their craft, now walking to villages with no looms, no capital, no trade connections. They became landless agricultural labourers, millions of them, flooding rural areas that couldn't support their own populations, let alone absorb a sudden influx of displaced artisans. Land became scarce, wages collapsed. A permanent landless underclass emerged for the first time in Indian history. But the British weren't done extracting. They imposed agricultural taxes pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, calculated before the harvest. Indian cultivators now owed more in taxes than they earned. The British openly admitted in Parliament they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, more than 3 times what Indian rulers had ever charged. Peasants couldn't afford to buy the grain they grew. When droughts hit, and droughts always hit, the British had a choice. They could stop exporting food, they could provision the population, they could reduce the crushing tax burden. They did none of these things. Instead, they exported grain to maintain tax revenues. Millions of tons of wheat and rice left Indian ports for Britain and other markets, while Indians starved in the countryside. The food existed, the people were too poor to buy it. British policy, the same policy that destroyed the textile industry, had made them too poor. Between 1770 and 1947, 35 million Indians died in preventable famines. More than Stalin's purges, more than Mao's Great Leap Forward, 5 times the Holocaust. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was the inevitable result of the chain the British had built. Destroy industry, flood the countryside with displaced workers, tax peasants into destitution, export food during droughts. Each link connected, each death preventable. Life expectancy dropped from around 27 years in the 1870s to 22 years in the 1920s during repeated famines. It didn't recover to 1870s levels until after independence. Think about that. Colonial rule made Indians' lives shorter. Some claim the Mughal decline caused this collapse, not British policy. But the Mughals ruled for over 200 years, and India remained an industrial power throughout. The economic infrastructure, skilled labour, merchant capital, export networks, was intact when the British arrived. The British ruled for 200 years, and India became impoverished. The difference? The Mughals became Indian. They reinvested wealth locally, married into Indian families, built monuments that still stand today. The British remained foreign. They extracted wealth to Britain, an estimated $43 trillion in today's terms. By 1947, only 16% of Indians were literate. For women, 8.8%. Put 13 Indian women in a room, only one could read. The British did nothing to educate the population they ruled for 200 years. The proof that this was policy, not inevitable progress? Independent India hasn't had a major famine in over 75 years. It rebuilt textile exports, regained industrial capacity, and now competes globally in manufacturing and services. Indian textile mills that emerged in the 1890s showed Indians could master industrial technology when given the chance. The mechanism wasn't technology, it was power and policy, deliberately designed to benefit Britain at India's expense. Tariffs, monopsony, duties, imports, and physical destruction worked together to crush Indian industry. This wasn't about technology or efficiency, it was about power and policy. This wasn't some invisible force of history, it was policy, deliberate, documented, and designed to transfer wealth from India to Britain. Roman senators once complained that all their gold was flowing to India. 2 centuries of British rule reversed that flow entirely. If this breakdown changed how you see colonial economics, hit like and subscribe for more hidden histories.